format, and it's been permitted by, I think, our leaders not calling it out, but it has resulted in me being looked after by the police for a couple of years, having to have panic alarms in my home, a Viscount even going to jail for wanting to have me killed, crowdfunding platforms raising money to hire hitmen. It seems so removed from anything that I ever thought would happen when I put my head up, to stand up for something I believed was right, and in a society where we have freedom of speech. But it means that fear became something that I felt every single day, going every single place.
You've got family, just to be clear.
And my children were suffering. Yes, I stopped going out with my children because I was worried that if anyone threw acid at me or shot me or did anything to me, that they would be there. So, I lived 2-3 years under real threat, and it was painful, to say the least.
You've got political views that some people disagree with. You've got political views that some people agree with. What is it about you that generated this volume, this scale of horrific personal threats, and often actual threats of physical violence?
Well, the thing was, it wasn't my place as a woman of colour that, I should not be speaking out. I should be in a kitchen. I should be quiet. I should be grateful. I should go back home. I'm too stupid to know what I'm talking about. It was a range of different, things I really did not think I'd hear again. Bearing in mind I grew up in the 70s here and was chased down Victoria Station by the National Front and called the P word and all those sorts of things. To see it still happening now, today, and my children facing it myself, is deeply, deeply disturbing.
Do you think we've gone backwards?
I think we've gone hugely backwards, because what happened is, as a society, our leaders and our politicians led by example and shut out those who were hateful, because hate has always been in our society and always will be. But now what we have is the door has been opened, I think, and in the name of winning, our leaders have lost their moral compass and will do anything, will play the race card and the sex card and the abuse and hate card just to win.
I should make clear, you're a Guyanese heritage. Some people say we've got an ethnic minority Prime Minister, we've got a Muslim Mayor of London, we've got a Muslim man in Humza Yousaf, who's First Minister of Scotland. Isn't that a sign that we have made great progress as a country?
Do you know, I look back at history, I was thinking yesterday, because I felt so sick in my stomach yesterday, and actually really very fearful in the fact that I am standing for Parliament. Because of the reaction of the leaders. And because of those individuals you just mentioned, surely they're the ones who should be shutting the door and stamping this out and actually standing up and saying that it's wrong. And their reactions makes me think of what happened in South Africa and the idea that you became an honorary white just to get on. What are they doing? They're not standing up for their race. Just because you are of a certain race or colour or creed, that does not mean that you are behaving in a way that actually is one that's promoting a peace and a society where we can live together. They're not doing that. They are actually even worse, I think, than the people who are perpetrating the hate, because they're not stamping it out, not speaking up against it.
Gina Miller, thank you very much indeed for coming.
The time is 5 to 9. One of the most profound changes in our lives, both individually and socially as well, is the very large number of people living until we are really quite old meaning 100 or so. There is a book that has just been released, a new novel entitled The Longevity Imperative, Building a Better Society for Healthier, Longer Lives. It outlines the innovations that are needed to make most of our longer life expectancies actually happen. It's by Andrew Scott, Professor of Economics at the London Business School, and he is on the line, and so is Dame Joan Bakewell, who's spoken, of course, extensively about keeping busy at the young age of 90. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Andrew, first of all, I call it a novel there. Is it a novel?
No, I hope it's a good read, but it's not a novel.
Well, it's been passed to me in a note as a novel, so whoever has read it on my behalf obviously hugely enjoyed it, which I think is, you couldn't have a better endorsement. But anyway, what's the point of it? What is the message you're trying to get across?
Well, I hope it's about a novel idea, which is the first time ever in human history the young and the middle age can expect to become old. We have, of course, always had old people, but it's only a minority who have lived that long. And we need to ensure that the longer lives we can now expect aren't just longer, but healthier for longer, productive for longer, and engaged for longer, for us to seize the opportunity. We hear a great deal about an aging society, which tends to be about decline, a rising number of older people, but the real change is that all of us, on average, can expect to live a lot longer and need to invest more in our future to make it a good one.
Yeah, it's that new period, isn't it, Joan Bakewell, that new period that opens up now for so many people and we've never really addressed properly.
Yes, I mean, there is a great burst of energy that comes when your children have grown up and left home. When your routine job, the one that you had and for which you drew a pension, has finished, and you have all your stamina remaining. I mean, old people enjoy a great burst of energy very often. A great many of them go into the world of volunteering, run our museums and galleries, run our social services. So there is a resource there that is not being used to the benefit of society, let alone the well-being of the people themselves.
And emotionally, at that level, Joan, for people who are in that position with so much still to give, the idea that it's not given or not asked for or not noticed is going to be an outrage, isn't it? Particularly if there are more and more of us.
It's worse than that, really, because one of the problems of old people now in society is isolation and loneliness. Very often a partner might die. You're left alone in your home with no function in society at all to give you any sense of purpose. So it's a really important social development to include people as they grow older, let alone use their skills and wisdom to help society generally.
Which, Andrew Scott, is easy to say, but what in practical terms do we need to do that we don't do at the moment?
Well, it's a very profound change. I mean, we really have to change the course of life, so it's not going to happen quickly. There's lots of things that can happen. We've got to stop underestimating the capacity of older people and our own later life. Because we are now likely to get old. We worry about getting old, so what do we do now? And that's about changes in our health system that focuses on health and not treating illness. It's about making sure that people can carry on working, not necessarily beyond the state pension age, but right now loads of people have to leave work before 50. So it's really about recognizing that aging is a process, not something that happens when you hit 65, and that we really have to make sure we age better on every dimension and invest more in our future.
And not necessarily medicalising that process.
I think one of the big problems is we haven't medicalised the concept of old age. We see it only in terms of decline, and as Joan was saying, old age isn't just about decline. There's loads of things that happen, and in fact, on average, people in their 80s are a lot happier than people in their 40s and 50s. So there's a thought.
Well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it, Joan, finally, and a positive one.
Yes, I thought it was interesting to see that research shows that people are less happy in middle age than they are in old age. I think in old age you've solved a lot of the problems that you've had. Your anxieties, your children, your finances have all in some way resolved themselves.
Jolly good. We'll leave it there. Andrew Scott, Joan Bakewell as well. Thank you both.
Quick clarification to finish. Earlier I was speaking to Michael Gove, during which I said the Palestine Solidarity Campaign was the group responsible for projecting the slogan "From the river to the sea onto the Elizabeth Tower." Whilst they organised the march, they say they weren't responsible for the projection. That is it from us today. Thank you so much for listening. Our editors were Jack Evans, and that's it. Have a great day.
BBC News at 9 o'clock. The Communities Secretary Michael Gove has set out the government's new definition of extremism, which is intended to determine which organisations qualify for government financial support. It'll cover organisations perceived to promote an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance. On the Today programme here on Radio 4, Mr Gove insisted free speech would be protected and said this wasn't about the government trying to suppress opinions it didn't agree with.
It's important to say that individual organisations that we decide not to deal with will still have the right of free speech, advocacy and freedom of association. So this is not about banning organisations. Quite rightly, there is a much higher threshold before an organisation such as Hizb ut-Tahrir is prescribed. This is simply saying that this is an organisation that we in government think it would be inappropriate to fund or engage with.
The Israeli military says it plans to move more than 1 million displaced Palestinians in Gaza to what it calls humanitarian islands in the middle of the Strip. It's ahead of a planned ground offensive in the southern city of Rafah. The John Lewis Partnership has returned to profit. It's announced pre-tax profits of £56 million in the year to the end of January, a year after losses of more than £230 million. The group is not paying staff a bonus, saying instead that it's increasing pay overall. 2 former financial traders who were jailed for manipulating the interest rate are having their cases reviewed today. Tom Hayes and Carlo Palombo say they were made scapegoats for failings in the system. Researchers say the number of middle-aged people dying from cancer in the UK is at a 25-year low. A reduction in the number of people who smoke is seen as a key driver of the rate coming down. But the researchers warned that cases of the disease have risen sharply over the same period due to factors such as obesity. And SpaceX is due to make a third attempt to launch its most powerful rocket, Starship, in the next few hours. Previous attempts have ended in explosions. NASA plans to use the rocket to send astronauts to the moon. BBC News.
Now, this isn't Strictly, it's Radio 4, but in a moment, we'll take to the floor for a dance so daring it revolutionised Britain. At 10, the Conservatives have produced all 3 female UK Prime Ministers, but are they going backwards in getting women into winnable parliamentary seats? Emma Barnett investigates in Woman's Hour, and after Oppenheimer dominated the Oscars, we're off to New Mexico, where much of the movie is set in from our own correspondent at 11. Now it's In Our Time with Melvin Bragg.
Hello. When the waltz reached Britain in the early 19th century, it revolutionised the role of dancing and music in our society, fracturing old ways and giving rise to new. While it may seem formal now, it was the informality and daring that drove its popularity, with couples holding each other as they spun around the room to the Blue Danube. And soon the waltz expanded the creative world in poetry, ballet, novellas, and in music that was neither exclusively classical nor vulgar, but popular. With me to discuss the waltz are Susan Jones, Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford, Derek Scott, Professor Emeritus of Music at the University of Leeds, and Teresa Buckland, Emeritus Professor of Dance History and Ethnography at the University of Roehampton. Teresa, can you give us some clear idea of the origins of the waltz?
Of course, it's very difficult to pinpoint the origins of any popular dance, but we know that during the Renaissance and the Baroque period in Europe, there were several turning dances, couple dances, a man and a woman turning together. But it's not until the mid-18th century that we start to get more and more references to dances such as Walzer and Dreher, and these are mostly in the Germanic lands that we hear about them. These dances then are taken sometimes by aristocrats, sometimes by soldiers returning from the Napoleonic Wars to Britain. And by the end of the first decade of the 19th century, the waltz had arrived and was here to stay, and it actually permeated throughout the whole of society. Prior to this, the main ceremonial dance in high society was the minuet, and in that, people stood side by side, i.e. a man and a woman stood side by side, and they traced elaborate patterns on the floor. And the revolutionary aspect of the waltz was that the man and woman turned to face one another, and then they spun round on their own axis, going clockwise, but progressing anti-clockwise around the ballroom. So this was totally revolutionary.
And not only face each other, they held each other.
They held
Often
each
very
other
closely.
very closely, sometimes a bit too closely for the likings of pastors and moral commentators. But it's such a revolutionary move. In fact, it's often been referred to as a shift in body paradigm. And in a way,
What do they mean by that?
body paradigm is the shift of the whole way of moving, a whole corporeal relationship to space and to other people. And from that, a whole new realm of dancers came out, which were known as round dancers. And there were lots of these dancers, not just the waltz. There was later followed by the polka and the mazurka. And there's a whole century of these round dancers. But the waltz was the first and the most stable.
So, Teresa, can you describe what it's like to dance the waltz?
There are lots of waltzes, but the main one in the 19th century was what was known as the rotary waltz, i.e. revolving around. And in that, the dancers took 6 steps over 2 bars of music. And of course, the key thing about the waltz is that it's in triple time. So it's 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. And in that time, you've done a whole circle. But at the same time, you're progressing around the room. And the sensation depends, of course, on the music. And the sensation, typically, if it's fast, you can get easily out of breath. And it's a very exhilarating feeling. But if the music's slower, of course, there's more of a sense of dreaminess, a dreamy quality, a sense of being lost in your own space. But of course the couple was actually locked into their own space, and that's the radical aspect of the waltz.
Thank you. Gary Scott, from early on the waltz was associated with the Germanic world.
At first, yes, the waltz very much associated with the German dance. Often the German dance meant waltz to the British. But what intrigues me is the 1820s, when Joseph Lanner and Joseph Strauss the Elder come on the scene. Then we have a revolutionary style of music that goes with the waltz. And in the hands of Johann Strauss, the father, new things happen which create the chasm that then opens up in the 19th century between what is seen as entertainment music and what is seen as art music or serious music. There's also the folk traditional kind of music, but now we have this third type of music. And if no one objects to my singing examples, I can give you an idea of some of the new things that Johann Strauss Sr. did. For example, his waltz Heimatklänge, that sounds of home, begins da da da. Well, that note is known as the leading note in music. Da should go to la. It's the note T, which will bring us back to do. But no, he goes da 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 da. He falls downward. This was regarded as very, very unusual at the time. In fact, it became known as the Wienerische Note, or in England, the Viennese note. He soon does the same with the sixth degree of the scale, the La. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. If I quote from Johann Strauss the Younger, Die Fledermaus, da 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 da. That note da should resolve downwards on da da. He leaves it hanging like that. That becomes a marker of the waltz and of the new popular style, that if you're a serious art musician, avoid that note. And finally, the papa accompaniment. That was very rare before Joseph Lanner and Johann Strauss the Elder. In fact, if you hear the papa in late Schubert, you bet that it's because he's been listening to Lanner or Strauss.
Can you account for the combination of music and the dance? I mean, they seem made for each other. Who made them for each other?
Well, because Strauss was a very proficient dance violinist, so he's very immersed in the style. Strauss and Lanner played together, but Lanner got the best job at being the leader of the court orchestra and playing for the court balls. But Johann Strauss, when he argued with Lanner, split up, made his way successfully in playing for dance halls for the middle class in Vienna. And he saw what was he was very alert to what was going to attract audiences. And it has to be said that half of the reason he was alert was he wanted to make money.
Well, it makes many people alert, doesn't it? I think the surprise in your voice which surprises me, really.
Well, I do have a puritanical nature.
Can we go to you, Susan? You have the music.
Yep.
Who was dancing it in the first place, and then why did it sort of spread across the plain?
It was sponsored by the court, and we're talking about the Austro-Hungarian Empire here. Yeah. And of course, famously, the Congress of Vienna is a moment when nations are coming together to solve the problem of the end of the Napoleonic era. And a lot of diplomacy was going on during the day, and a lot of waltzing was a kind of relief at night. So you were getting diplomats in, all sorts of people. And then, of course, it spreads to further down the chain. But it's also associated with the lascivious, the rather racy side of the waltz coupling. So when
You're suggesting that the lascivious and the evasive side is only good when you go down the chain?
It's only, well, I'm not suggesting that at all, and I think, for example, Lord Byron was one who thought that it was there all the way through. So when it comes to England, you know, you're really dealing with I mean, okay, it has a kind of moral opprobrium attached to it, but at the same time, it is acknowledged by the Hanoverian monarchs that this is doable because they like doing it.
And it becomes irresistible very quickly, doesn't it?
It becomes very irresistible, and it's interesting you use that word, irresistible, because that's exactly what Jane Austen's narrator in Emma talks about the waltz when they're going to have a gathering which is hopefully going to generate some kind of romantic coupling, and somebody's playing the irresistible waltz. It's very interesting the way Austen uses this particular word here.
It seems its influence seems to spread outside dance and into the other arts.
Yes, I think it, particularly with relation to Byron, for example, who famously wrote a satire on waltzing in 1812. He published it in 1813 and then really distanced himself from this satire. He gave the poem, it's the long poem, a narrative voice by one gentleman farmer or gentleman yeoman, Horace Hornham, and he's worried about his daughters, engaging in this. So Byron kind of sets a certain tone for the literary responses to the waltz, particularly, I think, because he introduces into the poem a reference to Werther, to Goethe's Werther, which was extremely influential throughout literary revolutions in...
Well, Goethe, I think, was extraordinarily influential. The young man
incredibly
took his own life.
And this kind of anxiety comes out in Byron's reference to Werther, where he actually cites Werther's reference to the waltz. He and Lottie are getting together and having this amazingly out-of-body experience almost. He said, I feel I'm not human, which is an extraordinary
Was this
thing.
while he was dancing, or?
I guess it was. Well, we don't know exactly what Goethe was thinking of there, but I think that's the idea, that there's a kind of transportation of the body beyond the body.
I think that's true, Sue, that there's the idea of being out of your own body, the sense of entering another world. But in the initial years, there was a lot of antagonism towards the waltz, but it then became the staple dance of the 19th century. It was so important, and it lasted, well, it still dances today, but it was the main dance on the ballroom. It went waltz, quadrille, quadrille, waltz, 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 waltz. By the end of the century, it was almost as though there was nothing other than waltz. And the problem was, by the end of the century, of course, was that young people were getting very tired of it indeed. And there was...
Tired of it or tired by it?
Probably a bit of both, because by the end of the century, the military bands were the main music providers, and they obviously as professional musicians got bored with the music and they wanted a bit more pep and go into it, and so they sped everything up, and of course that delighted the young people but not the old people who were watching, and there was lots of complaints about rowdyism in the ballroom.
So can you just tell us a little bit more, in your view, why there was, what you alluded to, this worrying side for parents and the more stage in society, that this was taking over?
Well, obviously it's about young men and young women being in very close proximity. They're dancing very often in ballrooms which are lit only by candlelight, and they might sneak off and get up to illicit activities.
You were to comment?
Well, first of all, I would say that the earlier waltz, when Byron gets annoyed about the waltz, is different to the waltz of the later 1820s. The waltz changes a lot. And yes, at first the worry is about the face-to-face and hand contact, and things, although gloves become mandatory to try and reduce fingers on bodies. But then you have to consider at that time the Empire line, there's not much corsetry or undergarments, so men can kind of feel around if they choose when they're dancing. But as the 1880s progress and ballrooms are built and parquet flooring is introduced, the waltz speeds up. The Landler, it had hops in it, it had some stamps in it. The waltz has glides, it gets faster and faster. People worry about women's dresses whirling up as they're going round. And all this begins to give the waltz a very sensual kind of atmosphere to it. And I'm thinking the one thing that always comes to mind when I think of the waltz in literature is Madame Bovary dancing the waltz in Flaubert's novel. You read that description, she's probably had a couple of glasses of champagne, the waltz makes you dizzy, it goes on for about 7 or 8 minutes, you get a 5-minute break then, and then another waltz starts. You're going, her head falls on the Viscount's chest at one point, she notices her dress is rubbing against his trouser leg, you know, and it's all very sensual. She collapses onto her chair at the end, but when she's on her deathbed, you know, the remarkable thing is that this is the one thing, the great thrill in her life. She remembers that waltz, where her life was a mess, but the waltz did it for her.
They also carried their own kit. The seamstresses were around the ballroom edges, because if anybody stood on the dress and it got ripped, they rushed on with a needle and thread and stitched it all together.
Men were not to wear boots in the dance hall.
And especially military men were not to wear spurs, of course. But then there were these poor wallflowers who used to go to the ballroom expecting to have their first debutante dance, and there were no men sometimes coming in, so the poor women would spend a lot of time in the anterooms pretending they were having their dresses sewn, when really it was just because they couldn't get a partner, because there weren't enough men in the ballroom by the end of the century.
Now let's talk about not enough men. It was quite difficult to get men onto the floor at the beginning, wasn't it? Because dancing, these are reasons, you tell me if I'm wrong, obviously. First of all, it was not thought to be manly to dance. Secondly, it was not thought to be the done thing to clasp a woman to your bosom and dance. And thirdly, it was thought to be rather lower class to dance like this. You should go back to the minuet and be good-mannered like your parents would be. Is there anything in that?
There's a lot to say about this, because certainly in the late 18th, early 19th century, if you wanted to be regarded as a gentleman, you should be able to dance and have the appropriate training from a dancing teacher.
So it had gone into a different phase then. It wasn't a sort of the rascals dance. It became a sort of
it became so accepted in society that it was expected that a man knew how to waltz. And one of the issues, of course, was dancers always had a problem with Christianity and also with Cartesian philosophy about the body being lesser than the mind and there being the mind-body split, etc. And of course the Victorians were wonderful at using this sort of philosophy to justify things. So for the men, very often they thought, well, that's to do with the body, it's what women do, dancing. And also they thought that it was unmanly to dance because from the mid-19th century in Britain, men were being sent away to public school. And at that point, dancing lessons had been replaced by rugby and organised sports. So the boys would get a little bit of training at home with their sisters in dancing, go away to public school, then they would go to university, then they would go into men's clubs. And so it created, by the end of the century, this homosocial atmosphere where they didn't really want to be with women and do women's things. So consequently, they just used to hang around in their London clubs and turn up when supper was served at some of the balls. And the poor hostesses were getting very annoyed because they had all these wallflowers and nobody to dance with them.
Yes, I think Teresa's right about the unmanliness of music in general, actually, but dancing in particular. And I think that it was helpful that the waltz was easy to dance. I mean, Mark Twain said it was the only dance he could do. All you had to do was whirl your partner around and try not to bump into the furniture. Whereas a minuet, you could spend weeks trying to learn the steps of a minuet.
with a minuet, you really needed a dancing teacher or a dancing master. And because what you were trying to do was to demonstrate your social distinction, because you could afford to employ somebody, and therefore with these social skills you might be able to rise up the hierarchy.
Susan?
Yes, I think that whole improvisational quality of the waltz is very important there. But going back to the issue of gender, of course we're jumping ahead here to the coming of the Ballet Russe in Paris and London. You know, one of the characters who was so formative in thinking about male dancing is Nijinsky, Václav Nijinsky, of the Ballet Russe company run by Serge Diaghilev. Now, there were plenty of male dancers on stage before Nijinsky, but he had a particular hit with a ballet in 1911, Le Spectre de la Rose, Spectre of the Rose, which was based on a Gautier and Vaudoyer scenario, and with choreography by Michel Fokine. And it tells the story of a young woman coming back from the ball. She's asleep, so she has to dance as if she's asleep, but she's being driven by the spirit of the waltz, and the waltz is incarnated, embodied by Nijinsky, who is a very muscular dancer. But what he did was to kind of feminize the idea of that masculinity. He made a pose with his arms in fifth position, au courant, which means the arms above the head, and he crossed them, the hands over, and leant slightly to the side, as if he's, you know, about to fade, perhaps, or give the scent of the rose to the girl he's driving through this waltz.
So if we've referred a little to how the aristocracy took it to heart, and the Queen Victoria even went, yes, but she did go.
She did.
dance,
She
right?
did.
Yeah.
She danced and she liked it.
She liked it, and we've talked about people who can go to ballrooms. But one of the interesting things for me is that it went right across society. So you're getting people in small towns and villages saying, "No, we needn't do these folk dances. We'll have a waltz now."
But the interesting thing is yes, they're all doing the waltz, but the question is where and how, because style distinguished who you were in the social hierarchy. So there are lots of images from dancing teacher manuals which show you this is the correct way to stand, this is the aristocratic way to stand, with an erect back, at a respectful distance from your partner, and glancing over the shoulder of your partner, never looking at them intently. Whereas if you're low class, you were very close together, you clutch your partner, and that was regarded as being the epitome of bad taste.
Yes, I've certainly read reviews of dancing in some New York ballrooms in the 1870s, and remarking on this very thing. Oh, they dance in such a vulgar way, these people.
But the British seem to admit that the Americans danced better than they did.
They did. They did. Well, that was because they took care over their lessons. And the problem, of course, as we've talked about, the men, of course, they're responsible for steering. And if you haven't had lessons, you don't always know how to steer your partner. And they weren't very good at going the other way around, even when they'd grasped the basics. So that's why a lot of people got very dizzy, was because they did what's known as the natural turn. You turn to the right all the time. And there's a very funny song by George Grossmith called Do You Reverse? Because it was thought to be the epitome of bad taste to reverse in front of Queen Victoria. And also actually in the Germanic courts as well. And I suspect that the reason for this is because people couldn't do it very well, and they didn't want anybody falling over in front of royalty.
Being taught and taught and taught to do that. Yeah.
It's not easy, is it?
Once you get the hang of it, it's all right. I mean, provided you don't want to be perfect.
But perseverance.
That's really interesting, because you know, James Joyce in Ulysses, in the CSA episode of Ulysses, actually talks about waltzing a lot. He's talking about Night Down of Dublin, of course, and he's talking about the red light district. But there are reverse turns in that description there, and there's very much a sense that the waltz is driving this scene. So it still retains that association with doubtful morals in that particular... Actually, he mentions the hesitation waltz. Perhaps that's one for...
Well, now we're into a sort of a new style of waltzing, which occurred towards the end of the 19th century, possibly from America.
In England or everywhere.
Mostly from America, but it was perfected, if one can say that, in England. It was called the Boston, which suggests where it came from, and unusually for a popular dance form, it was developed by the upper middle classes. It wasn't one of those dances that necessarily came from the peasantry or from a folk background. It was already the existing style of... Not the style, it was the existing basis of waltz. It was done to waltz music, but there's a new style of waltz music comes in the 1900s, and the response of that by the dancers was to glide walk and also not to turn the feet out, because the waltz had always been danced in the 19th century using the ballet technique, toe down first, feet turned out. Up on your toes as you went down, up, down, up, and you use your third position to turn. Young people didn't want that in the early 1900s, and listening to these dreamy waltzers, they wanted to glide. So what they did was to walk, and you get this long, stretched out walking on the diagonal to this dreamy music, which, Derek, I think, you know, like The Merry Widow and...
Oh, yes, two things happen, really. There is, as you say, the Boston waltz. It tends nearly always to be called the English waltz in England, and